They did not fall because their enemies were stronger. They fell because of what they did in the dark. And what they did in the dark was monstrous. There is a castle in Eastern Europe that local villagers still refuse to pass after sunset. Not because of superstition. Not because of old folklore whispered by grandmothers near dying fires. They refuse to pass it because their grandmothers were there. Because their great-grandfathers heard the screaming from inside those walls. Because memory, in certain places, does not fade the way historians would prefer it to. Memory clings to stone. Memory seeps into the earth beneath your feet. And in this corner of the world, the earth remembers everything. This is the story of the Betrayal Dynasty. One of the most powerful noble families in the history of Central Europe. A family that produced generals and princes and governors. A family whose name commanded armies and bent the will of kings. A family that sat at the absolute pinnacle of European power for over 2 centuries. And a family that harbored, within its grand halls and behind its iron gates, one of the most disturbing secrets in recorded human history. A secret that was not fully uncovered until it was too late for over 600 people. A secret that, when it finally surfaced, was so grotesque, so incomprehensible, so deeply embedded in privilege and power, that the authorities who uncovered it spent years debating whether to tell the world the truth or simply make it disappear. They almost made it disappear. We're going to make sure they could not. Welcome. You are watching the channel that refuses to let history bury what history tried to hide. And tonight, we go somewhere that most historians approach with careful, measured language and qualified statements. Tonight, we are done being careful. Tonight, we tell you exactly what happened inside Castle Achtis. Exactly what was found in its dungeons. Exactly why one of the most powerful women in European history was sealed alive inside her own bedroom and left to die alone in the dark. And exactly what her story reveals about the machinery of power, about who it protects, who it sacrifices, and whose screams it is willing to not hear. If this is your first time here, welcome. Stay with us. Because this story has layers that go far deeper than any single account you have read before. And before we go further, if you believe history should be told without omission, without the sanitizing comfort of official narratives, hit that like button right now and subscribe. Because that is exactly what we do here, every single week. Let us begin. Not with Elizabeth Bathory herself. Let us begin somewhere else entirely. Let us begin with the world that made her possible. The year is 1560. The Kingdom of Hungary exists in a state of fractured, anxious survival. The Ottoman Empire has consumed the south and east of the country in wave after wave of military advance. The Habsburgs hold the north and west with the iron grip of an empire that considers Hungary a frontier province worth defending primarily because of what lies beyond it. In between these two crushing forces, the Hungarian nobility has developed a particular relationship with power. They hold it absolutely within their own domains. They answer to no one below them. They answer to those above them only when they must. And they have learned, over generations of war and occupation and political survival, to do whatever is necessary to maintain their position. Whatever is necessary. That phrase will matter before this story is done. Into this world, in 1560, Elizabeth Bathory is born. She is born into one of the most powerful families in Hungarian history. Her uncle is the King of Poland. Her cousin will become the Prince of Transylvania. Her family has produced military commanders who held back Ottoman advances that would otherwise have consumed Central Europe. She is educated in multiple languages. She reads Latin. She manages estates. She is, by every measure available to a woman of her era and class, extraordinary. She is also, by the accounts of those who knew her in youth, strikingly beautiful. A portrait from her early adulthood shows a woman of high cheekbones and dark, watchful eyes. A woman whose intelligence is visible even through the formal conventions of 16th century portraiture. A woman who seems, in that portrait, to be looking at the viewer with the calm, assessing gaze of someone who has learned very early that the world is a dangerous place and that safety lies in understanding it precisely. She marries at 15. Her husband is Dynasty, a military commander of considerable reputation known across Central Europe as the Black Knight of Hungary for his campaigns against Ottoman forces. He is, by all accounts, brutal in battle and largely absent from home. He gives Elizabeth control of his estates, his finances, his household. He goes to war. She runs an empire. For 25 years, while her husband is fighting on frontiers, Elizabeth Bathory manages one of the largest private landholdings in Central Europe with documented efficiency. She corresponds with diplomats. She defends her estates legally and militarily. She raises her children. She maintains a court. She is, in the formal record of her era, a noblewoman of exceptional competence operating within the limits that her society placed on women of her class. And she is exceeding those limits quietly, constantly, in every direction that does not require permission. Dynasty dies in 1604. He is 50 years old. The cause is recorded as illness, possibly related to wounds accumulated over decades of combat. Elizabeth is 44 years old when she becomes a widow. She is at the peak of her administrative power. She controls estates across the Kingdom of Hungary. She controls hundreds of servants and dozens of staff. She controls, in the political geography of her era, something approaching a small sovereign domain. And she is answerable, now that her husband is dead, to essentially no one. It is at this point that the rumors begin. Not the rumors that circulate later, after everything has been exposed. The earlier rumors. The quiet ones. The ones that servants carry from one estate to another in the way that servants always carry information carefully, in pieces, never the whole picture at once, always with the awareness that saying too much to the wrong person has consequences. These rumors involve missing girls. Girls from the local villages who came to work at the castle and did not come back. Girls whose families were told they had been sent to positions elsewhere. Girls whose absence was explained by the same stories, in slightly different variations, over and over across different villages and different years. She left for a better position. She ran away with a man. She was dismissed for theft. She was moved to a different estate. The stories were plausible. The girls were poor. Poor girls disappeared. Poor girls were invisible in the social architecture of 16th century Hungary in a way that made their disappearance entirely unremarkable to the authorities whose job it would otherwise have been to remark upon it. The rumors circulated for years. Possibly for decades. The local pastor in the village nearest to Castle Achtis reportedly recorded concerns in his parish notes. The local count, Gyry Thurs, received communication suggesting that something at the castle required attention. Multiple local officials were aware, at varying levels of specificity, that something was wrong. Nothing happened. Elizabeth Bathory was a Bathory. Her name was armor. Her connections were architecture. The machinery of power that should have investigated was the same machinery of power that her family had built and maintained for 2 centuries. You do not turn the machinery against itself. You do not, in 1604 or 1605 or 1606, walk up to the gates of a Bathory castle and demand answers. Not unless you are willing to lose everything. And in Hungary, in the early 17th century, losing everything was not a metaphor. But then, something changed. Something that the machinery of power had not accounted for. The girls stopped being poor. In the years after her husband's death, something in Elizabeth Bathory's operation shifted. The village girls, the peasant girls whose disappearance could be explained and absorbed and forgotten, they were no longer enough. The castle's operation required more. Required girls of better quality, girls with more refined bearing, girls who could be presented as receiving instruction in the courtly arts. And so a new arrangement was established. Letters were sent to minor noble families across the region. Families of limited means but aristocratic name. Families who wanted their daughters educated in the ways of court, trained in the skills that would allow them to make advantageous marriages. Families who were offered, by one of the greatest noble houses in Hungary, something they could not easily refuse. Come and send your daughters to Castle Achtis. They will be educated. They will be elevated. They will be returned to you with prospects they could never have achieved without this opportunity. 25 young women from noble families entered Castle Achtis in the years between 1609 and 1610. Not one of them came back. And noble families, unlike peasant families, had the connections, the resources, and the social standing to demand answers that could not be deflected with a story about a better position elsewhere. The machinery began to turn. György Thurs, the Count Palatine of Hungary, effectively the highest administrative official in the kingdom beneath the king himself, received enough information by late 1609 to understand that the situation at Castle Achtis required personal attention. He assembled a party. He rode to the castle on the night of December 29, 1610. He arrived without announcement. He arrived with authority sufficient to override any objection. He arrived in the middle of the night because that is when truth lives, not in the prepared answers of daylight, but in what the darkness has not yet had time to hide. What he found has been recorded in the official investigation documents that followed. Those documents exist. They are held in archives in Slovakia and Hungary. They have been studied by historians. And what they describe in the formal, precise Latin of official 17th century documentation is something that strips the clinical language entirely away and leaves only what it is. He found a dead girl in the main hall. He found 2 more girls in the cellar, dying from wounds that the documents describe with a specificity that makes the reading of them deeply uncomfortable even for centuries later. He found Elizabeth B. Thory. She did not flee. She did not deny. The accounts suggest that she was calm. That she looked at Thurs with the same watchful, assessing gaze of the portrait. That she said, reportedly, something to the effect that what happened in her household was her business and that he had no authority to be present. She was wrong about the authority. She was not wrong about the attitude. She had lived her entire life inside a system that had never held her accountable for anything. She had operated for years within full sight of a world that had chosen not to see. She had no framework available to her, no template, no precedent, in which someone of her name and her standing and her history was made to answer for what she had done to people who had no name. The investigation that followed produced testimony from over 300 witnesses. Servants who had worked in the castle. Villagers who had brought daughters and received only silence in return. Surviving staff members who described, in detail, over a period of months, what had occurred inside those walls across what the testimony suggested were years, possibly decades. The total number of victims arrived at through the investigation was recorded by the chief investigator as 650. This number has been disputed by certain historians. Some argue the true number was lower. No credible historian argues it was 0. The physical evidence found in the castle during and after the initial raid, evidence that the investigation documents describe in terms that will not be repeated here because they do not need to be, was consistent with the testimony. The castle had not been hiding rumors. The castle had been hiding a reality so far beyond rumor that the officials who uncovered it spent weeks in documented discussion about how to handle what they had found. Elizabeth B. Thory was never tried. This is the fact that sits at the center of this story like a stone in still water, sending rings out in every direction if you look at it long enough. She was never tried. The woman whose servants gave testimony to over 300 witnesses. The woman in whose castle the physical evidence was found. The woman who had been apprehended at the scene. She was never brought before a court. She was never given a charge, a defense, a verdict. She was never, in the formal legal sense that her era understood, convicted of anything. 4 of her servants and associates were tried. They were convicted. They were executed, burned and beheaded, and their bodies destroyed in ways that the era reserved for crimes against the divine order of things. They were held accountable with the full, terrible machinery of 17th century justice. And Elizabeth B. Thory was sealed inside a set of rooms in Castle Achtis with the windows bricked over and a small slot in the door through which food was passed. And she was left there for 3.5 years. Until she was found dead on the floor of those sealed rooms on August 21 St. 1614. Why was she not tried? The official explanation given by Thurs at the time was that a public trial would bring shame upon the nobility of Hungary. That the Báthory name was too important to the functioning of the kingdom to be destroyed by a public proceeding. That discretion served the state better than spectacle. These are the words of a man operating within a system that had, for 2 centuries, operated on the principle that the powerful are managed differently than the powerless. That the machinery of accountability runs on different rules depending on who is standing beneath it. Thurs was not wrong, in the terms of his own world. He was doing what that world required. He was protecting the system. He was managing the situation. He was ensuring that the damage to the name, to the nobility, to the political architecture of the kingdom was contained. He was also, it should be noted, in significant debt to Elizabeth Báthory. Her husband had lent Thurs considerable sums of money. Money that, with her imprisonment and the legal complications that followed, became considerably easier to manage than it would have been had she remained free and in full possession of her considerable legal faculties. This is recorded. This is documented. This is not conspiracy, it is the ordinary, grinding logic of how power protects itself. It is the story that repeats itself across centuries and continents with such consistency that it begins to feel less like history and more like physics. Like a law of nature. Those with enough power are not destroyed by what they do. They are managed. They are contained. They are sealed behind bricked windows rather than placed in the docks. And the people who manage them benefit from the management. The servants burned. Elizabeth Báthory sat in her sealed rooms. The Báthory name was protected. The debt was managed. The machinery of power continued to turn, all with the same logic it had always run on. The 650 or however many the true number was received the justice available to the powerless in a world run by the powerful, which is to say, their suffering was acknowledged, their evidence was used, and their names were never recorded. We do not know a single victim's name. Not one. In over 300 witness testimonies, in thousands of pages of investigation documents, in the surviving records of one of the most extensively documented criminal investigations of the 17th century, not one victim's name was preserved. They came from villages. They came from minor noble families. They came from the poverty and aspiration of their era, drawn toward a great house that promised education and elevation and a better future. And the great house took everything they had and left nothing that history thought worth recording except the number. 650. A number. Not names. A count. Not people. The same erasure that made their disappearance possible in the first place was applied to their memory afterward, with the same efficiency and the same indifference. Here is what no one tells you about this story. Here is the part that the popular accounts, the ones that focus on Elizabeth Báthory as a monster, as a singular aberration, as a creature so far outside the human norm that she becomes almost mythological. Here is the part that those accounts bury under the weight of the horror itself. She was not operating alone. She was not operating in secret. She was not, in the full sense of the word, hidden. She had accomplices. Named accomplices. Documented accomplices. Women who assisted her. Women who recruited victims. A man who helped dispose of what the castle produced. All of these people were known to those around them. All of them had operated, for years, in the full sight of a community that saw enough to know something was wrong and not enough to know precisely what. And above them, above the accomplices, above the castle, above the local village with its silent pastor and his carefully worded parish notes were the officials. The counts. The administrators. The men who received reports. The men who read letters and decided that the name on the gate was sufficient reason to keep walking. The men who built the wall of protection around what was happening inside that castle, not through active conspiracy but through the far more ordinary mechanism of choosing not to see what they had not yet been forced to see. This is the darkest secret of Castle Achtis. Not what Elizabeth Báthory did. Not the horror in the dungeons. The darkest secret is the infrastructure of inattention that surrounded it. The years of quiet, collective, officially maintained not seeing. The number of people who knew enough to ask a question and chose, for reasons of politics and debt and name and the fundamental human calculation that powerful people are not worth the cost of confronting, chose to stay silent. Chose to keep walking. Chose to send the next daughter's family a polite letter explaining that she had gone to a better position elsewhere. The mythology that grew around Elizabeth Bathory in the centuries after her death transformed her into something supernatural. The legend of bloodbaths, of bathing in the blood of young women to preserve her beauty, appears in sources written decades after her death, without corroboration in the original investigation documents. Historians have debated its veracity extensively. What is interesting about the legend is not whether it is true. What is interesting is what it does. It takes a story about systemic failure, about a woman protected by a system of power and privilege and collective inattention, and it transforms it into a story about one extraordinary monster. It makes the horror singular. It makes it aberrant. It makes it safely inhuman. And in doing so, it removes from the story the most disturbing element of all, which is the utter, devastating ordinariness of the machinery that allowed it to continue. The debt. The name. The parish notes carefully worded to avoid direct accusation. The administrators who received reports and filed them. The families who were told their daughters had gone elsewhere and chose to believe it because the alternative required confronting something that the entire structure of their world was not designed to confront. Castle Achtis still stands. Or rather, its ruins still stand, roofless walls on a hilltop in what is now western Slovakia, visible from the village below. The village is small. The roads are quiet. There are signs now, directing tourists up the hill to the ruins. There is a museum in the nearby town. The tourism board of the region has an uncomfortable relationship with the castle's history. It draws visitors, which is economically useful, but the nature of what it draws them to requires careful management of the story that is told. The story that is most commonly told is the one about the monster. The singular, exceptional, almost supernatural figure. The Blood Countess. The female Dracula. The woman so far outside normal human experience that she can be visited as you visit a haunted house, with the comfortable knowledge that what she represents has nothing to do with the world you live in and the systems you inhabit and the choices that ordinary, non-monstrous people make every day about what they are willing to see and what they are not. That comfortable knowledge is the lie. That is what the ruins on the hilltop are really asking you to reckon with, if you are willing to stand there long enough and ask the right questions. Not what she was, but what surrounded her. Not the monster in the castle, but the world that built the castle, and staffed the castle, and received reports about the castle, and decided, year after year, that the name on the gate was more important than what the name was protecting. Elizabeth Bathory died alone in her sealed rooms in the summer of 1614. Whatever she felt in those final years, whatever reckoning, if any, occurred in the darkness behind the bricked windows is not recorded. The slot in the door through which food was passed was found untouched on the morning of August 21. The guards reported that she had complained of cold hands the night before. The physician who examined her recorded the cause of death as natural causes. She was 54 years old. She was buried first in the church at Achtis. But the villagers objected. The villagers, the people who had lived nearest to the castle, who had sent daughters and received silence, who had heard things from behind those walls that the official record had chosen not to fully transcribe, the villagers said no. They said her body could not rest in their church. They said the ground beneath their village was not the ground for her. And so she was moved. Transported to her family's ancestral estate at Ext. Whether she received a funeral of any dignity, whether she was mourned by anyone, whether anyone stood at her grave and felt anything other than relief, none of this is recorded. The four accomplices were buried in whatever manner was deemed appropriate for people whose bodies had been destroyed by the machinery of justice. Their names survive only in the trial documents. They are not remembered. They are not mourned. They are footnotes to a footnote. The 650 have no graves that anyone has ever found. They have no memorial. They have no names in the record. They have a number. And they have this. This account. This refusal to let the story be only about the monster and not about the world that fed her. This insistence that the most important thing about Castle Achtis is not the horror inside it but the silence outside it. The years and years of choosing not to see. The debt. The name. The parish notes. The administrators. The machinery of protection that runs on the same logic in every century, in every empire, in every system built by people who have decided that power has its own rules and that those rules apply differently depending on whose name is on the gate. The ruins are still there on the hilltop. The village is still there below. The roads are quiet in the evenings. The grass grows long around the stones in summer. The wind moves through the roofless walls in a way that the locals have never fully found comfortable. They do not pass it after dark, even now. Not because of superstition. Not because of legend. Because of something older than both. Because of the particular weight that a place accumulates when enough suffering has soaked into its stones. When enough silence has been maintained for long enough. When enough names have been swallowed and enough numbers have been substituted and enough machinery has been run on behalf of the powerful and against the powerless. The stones know. The earth knows. The wind that moves through the roofless walls of Castle Achtis on a quiet evening in western Slovakia knows something that the official record has never been entirely willing to say. It was never just one monster. It was never just one castle. It was a world that looked at a gate with the right name on it and decided that whatever was happening behind that gate was not its problem. And the most haunting question that history has never answered, the question that follows you down the hill from the ruins and back to the village and back into the ordinary world of ordinary days, is not what she did. It is simpler than that. It is smaller. It is more uncomfortable. It is this. How many gates are we walking past right now?